And it's a great pleasure to welcome our very special guest, all the way from the Upaya Monastery in Santa Fe in America, Roshi Joan Halifax. Welcome, Roshi Joan.
Thank you so
Roshi
much.
Joan is a Zen Buddhist teacher, an anthropologist, and a social activist who has worked on environmental, human rights, and justice issues since the 60s. The Upaya Monastery is a Buddhist study centre committed to social engagement. Joan has worked with inmates on death row and served the dying for many decades. She is an author. Her most recent book is called Standing at the Edge, Finding Freedom Where Fear and Courage Meet. Some of you will have heard her speak last year at our conference in the Blue Mountains, where she spoke on wise hope in social engagement. So we're delighted she's agreed to speak with us Aussies again. Her topic is compassion, a quality I suspect will be needed more than ever as those in the US in particular continue to battle COVID-19. It's a battle very serious in that part of the world. Roshi, thank you so much for your time this morning. Perhaps we could begin, if you could define what you mean by compassion.
Yes, I'm very happy to do that. So I look at compassion in a way that is maybe more granular than many others, because a number of years ago, as a result of working with healthcare providers, particularly in the end-of-life care field, and seeing that many healthcare providers were actually themselves suffering in the process of giving care, and that there was an increasing deficit of compassion in the healthcare field. And I valued, as both a person who's been in that field since 1970, I'm going to, maybe you can mute. Okay, good. Just to keep the noise down, the distracting noise down. But in any case, I wanted to, as a longtime Buddhist practitioner and a person working in the end-of-life care field, what I realized was that the most important process and quality of mind when caring for dying people was, in fact, the experience of compassion. And I realized that compassion was very poorly understood by many people, often associated merely with religion or looked on as a kind of threat to identity. Or if you were compassionate, you might end up experiencing compassion fatigue, a term developed by Figley, which has now been disputed by a number of neuroscientists and social psychologists, but it actually pushed compassion away as a valuable quality, mental quality, in care of the dying or in the healthcare field. And so I was appointed as a distinguished visiting scholar at the Library of Congress a number of years ago, and I left my monastery here. And I went to Washington, D.C. and spent quite a bit of time there in the beautiful Jefferson Library, doing a careful analysis of compassion and developing a heuristic map of compassion, which was based on neuroscience, social psychology, but as well insights from Buddhism. And briefly, in the general sense, compassion has been defined as that aspiration to alleviate the suffering of others, to be of benefit to others who are suffering. But I recognize that actually compassion was quite difficult to train others in, that compassion was actually more nuanced than that simple definition, and that it was important to, how can I say this? It was important to identify the qualities of mind associated with compassion that eventually would lead to the development of a tool, an instrument, a process, which healthcare providers, but now educators and people in many other fields are using, that's based on this map of compassion. And very simply, we could say that compassion involves the actual capacity to attend to the experience of others. And this has to do with the capacity to develop attentional balance, the ability to allocate your attention to another in a way that is grounded, that when our attention is allocated to another, given to another, we're able to sustain it for a good period of time, where that attentional capacity is characterized by high resolution, by a kind of granularity of perception. And with that, one is able to perceive what is going on more realistically. And I realized that the capacity for compassion was really foundationally related to the cultivation of attentional balance. One could also call it mindfulness per se. But compassion also involves the capacity to actually feel concern for others. We can bring our attention to someone or something, but it doesn't mean that our aspiration, if you will, or our motivation is altruistic. And so feeling concern for another is a really important element in the experience of compassion. And the social psychologists would call this a prosocial process, as distinct from antisocial. So this feeling of concern for others is very important. Another aspect of compassion is the capacity to actually sense what might serve another in terms of alleviating suffering. And so, being able to sense that is in part due to, our altruistic aspiration, due to our capacity to attend, to bring our attention to another, but also it's our capacity to actually discern, to look deeply at what might serve another. And this takes a number of qualities in order to do that, which include, the capacity to actually attune to another, to be in physical resonance, to be in affective resonance or emotional resonance, to be able to do perspective taking. In other words, to actually be able to experience the view of another. But it's also involved in being context sensitive. In other words, not only what will serve our patient, but as well what is congruent with the expectations or demands of the institution we're serving in, the expectation of family members and so forth, and also our colleagues. So that capacity of discernment, to be able to look really deeply and past our biases, and also to look with this ability to not just to be working out of a rubric, if you will, out of an algorithm, but to see things in a really fresh way, and also from a systems perspective. And then another quality of compassion, of course, is the actual engagement or action in relation to the person or the situation where suffering is present. So it's potentially to be of service. So as you can see, we're dealing with here a quite an interesting confluence or suite of capacities, which we as Buddhist practitioners are quite attuned to. In other words, our practice is about the cultivation of attentional balance. Our practice, of course, is related to altruism, to our deep motivation. Our practice is about the cultivation of wisdom, of deep looking, seeing things not just in terms of the situation directly in front of us, but seeing things from the perspective of paticca of interdependence, also of anicca, of the truth of change and so forth, and also actually of anatta, of the absence of an inherent self. And so this kind of wisdom feature is really important, but that we're not bystanders. We're in a relationship with ourselves and the world, which is braided. And so action is very important, action that is ethically based, that is congruent with values of care and such. So this is, as you see, is a much more nuanced approach to compassion. And as I began to develop this map, I realized that each of the features that I identified in the sort of bigger, more complex map of compassion were, from the Buddhist perspective, all of them were trainable. And I was like, wow. In other words, we can train each of these capacities within most individuals, if not all. And that when those capacities come together in a certain alchemy, compassion is an emergent process within this suite of features. So out of that, I developed a tool. Now, in the world of care of the dying, we have, actually, I want to read the words of one of my students, who is, I often share with people, a wonderful health care provider, head of a hospice in the Bay Area. And he wrote me an email late one night, and I was just so moved by his words, because I thought, wow, this is compassion in action. And the doctor's name is Dr. Gary Pasternak. And these are the words that he shared. He said, "I'm up late admitting patients to the inpatient hospice unit. And just when I think I'm too old for these late nights without sleep, a person in all their rawness, vulnerability, and pain lays before me. And as my hands explore the deep wounds in her chest and my ears open to her words, my heart cracks open once again. And this night, the sweet 36-year-old woman with her wildly catastrophic breast cancer speaks of her acceptance and her hope for her children, and she speaks with such authenticity and authority. And her acceptance comes to me as the deepest humility a person can experience. And then again, once again, I remember why I stay up these late nights and put myself in the company of the dying." So I've carried Gary's words with me for many years because his capacity to bear witness to the truth of suffering with humility, to be in resonance with, to listen deeply to this young woman's words, to listen to her heart, to not collapse under the weight of the suffering of another, but in a way to reaffirm his vow to serve. And I recall the words of an extraordinary writer in our country, Terry Tempest Williams. And she wrote, "A good friend of mine said, you are married to sorrow. And I looked at him and said, I'm not married to sorrow. I choose not to look away. I'm not married to sorrow. I choose not to look away. For me, this is compassion. Our capacity to bear witness deeply to the suffering of others, or even our own suffering. Never being a bystander. But also, I remember words of another great woman clinician and teacher, Rachel Naomi Remen, and she's a doctor and really an exceptional person. And she said, helping, fixing, and serving are three different ways of seeing life. When you help, you see life as weak. When you fix, you see life as broken. And when you serve, you see life as whole. When you help, you see life as weak. When you fix, you see life as broken. When you serve, you see life as whole. So as practitioners, I feel this is very important because I think what Dr. Remen is pointing to is the tendency of many healthcare providers or caregivers and others to engage in what has been called pathological altruism. That is altruism which could harm ourselves, disempower or harm the person whom we're endeavoring to serve, harm the institution that we're serving in or the institution or nation, for example, like Haiti or other nations where the UN has gone in and just made a mess of things, where the endeavor to be of some service has actually ended up causing more suffering. You know, it's important to understand what the role of clinicians is, which is to serve, and also to create the conditions, among clinicians where they can recall the calling that brought them into the profession of being a physician or a nurse, a physician's assistant, a social worker, a chaplain. It's to understand that our work in this field is about alleviating the suffering and or total pain, which is a term used by Dame Cecily Saunders to describe the pain of not just physical pain, but existential pain, spiritual pain, economic pain. The suffering that happens as a result of being gravely ill and the impact on one's family. So the total pain of those who are ill. And also healthcare providers of needs must attend to the suffering of the family members or friends of the caregivers who are supporting a dying person, for example. And yet they also must address the suffering of their colleagues. I think this is something that is often neglected in the healthcare field and also not acknowledged or addressed in the education of healthcare providers. Now, for example, in my country, we know that up to 60% of practicing physicians report symptoms of burnout. And this includes the experience of emotional exhaustion. It also includes depersonalization, which is objectifying the patient or the family member or even their colleagues. And also a low sense of accomplishment, the feeling that they're not doing any good. And this, of course, affects the quality of care that clinicians are delivering. And so in my book, Standing at the Edge, I articulate what I termed as edge states. These are positive qualities within the human psyche that have deep shadows that are important to recognize and not be subject to if possible. But if we do fall over the edge, if you will, of these edge states, it is to recognize two things: that the transformation of the negative quality of the edge state can actually strengthen our character, should we be so fortunate. And that the leverage of transformation, in fact, is compassion. And those edge states include altruism, without which none of us would be alive. If you know what I'm saying. I mean, our parents, no matter how complicated they were, or our foster parents, still, you and I made it to whatever age we are. And as completely vulnerable infants and young children, there must have been at least some altruism in order to ensure our survival. But as I defined a few minutes ago, the shadow side of altruism is pathological altruism, which is the physical or psychological harm to oneself by placing the needs of others above oneself, so that we become mentally or physically or economically damaged. And it is very interesting because this pathological altruism is often associated with women, that our self-sacrificing tendencies, also our need to be identified as really good people, and our way to power or recognition is often because we have been, deep service to others, but often causing harm to ourselves. Another edge state that I've written about in the book, Standing at the Edge, is empathy. And I wrote, a world without empathy is a world where we're dead to each other. We really need that sense of resonance as we're connecting, as we're interacting with each other. Yet, if we are not able to distinguish self from other, we can move, and we over-identify with someone who's suffering. We can experience what the social psychologists have called empathic distress, which is the dysfunction that arises from exposure to the suffering of others. When that exposure, that experience of identification is too great, and we move into the situation of vicarious suffering. And I think, I have sat with so many people in grief over my decades of doing this work. And I know in my first years, because of the losses in my own life at a young age, I often over-identified with the grief of others and became overwhelmed, was basically emotionally or psychically disabled through the experience of empathic over-arousal and empathic distress. And I think this is true for many caregivers. Another edge state that I've written about is that of integrity, how important it is that we stand within our values in how we relate to ourselves, this earth, each other, and so forth. Integrity is, for me, one of the most important processes and values that we can have. And yet, when our integrity begins to fall away, we can experience what is called moral suffering. And this includes moral distress when we are in the interacting, say, with a dying person or a homeless person, and where we see a pathway through to alleviate that suffering. But because of institutional demands or other constraints, we're not able to actualize the help or support the well-being of another, and we experience moral distress. Moral injury, which is the second form of moral suffering that I've written about, is a very important experience for us to understand at this time, particularly in my country, where clinicians are overwhelmed in hospital settings with not sufficient PPE, protective equipment, not enough ventilators, not enough blood products in order to save lives, and feel as though they're participating in the harm of their patients, or where they have to prioritize the allocation of resources. Say, an older person comes in with COVID-19, a younger person, there's one ventilator, what do you do? Do you choose to let the older person die, basically suffocate from this terrible plague? Or what do? Do you give them the ventilator, or do you give the young person the ventilator who has a longer life path ahead? Clinicians are facing this every single day in my country. I hear from hundreds of them every week, experiencing profound moral injury, which is primarily associated with the military, but now is being understood as damaging the morale of clinicians in a serious way as they endeavor to save the lives of their patients. So moral injury. And then moral outrage. And this is the experience of a combination of disgust and anger that is, instead of the blame toward oneself, it is actually shaming and blaming others. And I have to say, as a political activist, my work encompasses, a number of different domains in my country and otherwise. As a political activist, particularly in relation to our government, where I'm so grateful we're going through a change of administration. But I myself have experienced moral outrage, being very outspoken about the harm caused by this administration. I think many women in Buddhism know this deeply in relation to sexual violations by Buddhist teachers of their students, and they experience moral outrage, not unjustified at all. But in fact, if chronic, can really cause damage not only to oneself, but also to others. However, it's very important to stand in one's principles and to, send one's voice. Just as Jack knows, the community that formed around these issues at the Sakyadhita Australia conference was, I heard and agreed with a lot of moral outrage that was being expressed in that context. But if it becomes one's primary meme, it is fundamentally disabling. And the fourth kind of moral suffering that I've identified is called moral apathy. And actually, I did not think of this term myself. I went to a film about the Black writer, or about the Black writer, James Baldwin. You might not have heard of him in Australia, but he's very well known in my country. And it's very powerful and shocking film about racism in our country. And at one point, Baldwin used the term moral apathy, and I was like, bingo. I really heard what he's saying, and this is, related to the experience fundamentally of being a bystander, for one, or being in a bubble of privilege, or in the grip of addiction as a way not to face the truth of suffering, the first noble truth of the Buddha. So it was just like, oh yes. And of course, that leads to moral disengagement. So this was very important area for me personally to explore, because I have experienced myself moral distress, moral injury, moral outrage, not so much moral apathy. I tend to move into the charnel ground of suffering as a kind of natural tendency in my own life. But I will say that, Buddhist practice can be a big bypass in this regard. And so, part of the work that I've done for decades is kind of shake the cage of Buddhist practice. It's wonderful that many Buddhist practitioners are monastic and deep contemplatives, but without understanding the power of the first turning of the wheel, as the Buddha described, the truth of suffering, the roots of it, the possibility of being free of it, and the path out of it, to realize that for many of us, being socially engaged is an absolute essential. We cannot just rest, many of us who are practitioners, in the sort of tower of Buddhism, or on top of the mountain, or in the cave. And there are many practitioners, my beloved friend Joanna Macy being one, of course, Sulak Shivaraksha, Thich Nhat Hanh, and many others who are socially engaged, for which I am so grateful, because I feel that Buddhist perspective and social engagement is really powerful, because it preserves the individual's integrity, enhances resilience, and of course, the engendering of compassion is fundamental in Buddhism and wisdom, interdependent. The fourth edge state that I identified and wrote about in the book is about respect, which is, really being able to uphold our view of others. And I remembered, Thich Nhat Hanh, and I myself worked in the prison system as a volunteer for many years on death row and maximum security, only with men who had been murderers. And also I've worked with people whose actions and views I deeply disagreed with, but I realized that it was important not to turn away from that as suffering too, and to become involved politically, or to speak to organizations whose views differed dramatically and values differed dramatically from my own. So respect is essential. My friend, John Paul Lederach, who's an international peacemaker, speaks to this, about how important it is that we recognize our common humanity and our common destiny. And yet we know, for example, whether we're in a Buddhist community or working in a hospital, that disrespect can be rampant. And so there are two axes of disrespect that I articulate. One is called horizontal hostility, and that is bullying, devaluing, disparaging, diminishing a peer or a group. And the other is called vertical violence, which would be, for example, like a physician treating a nurse disrespectfully. Or it could be bottom up, a patient, which we're seeing in our country. There are patients who are coming into the emergency room who are in complete denial of being sickened by this virus, and who are bullying healthcare providers even as they're dying, vertical violence, bottom up. Or when a student bullies a teacher, bottom up, top down. When a teacher disparages or bullies a student. So respect and disrespect are really important vectors here. And the last edge state that I identified in the book, but anything can be an edge state, even grief. They're very integrating and positive aspects, important aspects that humanize us in the experience of grief. Even the nuns of the Buddha who stood by his body and tears fell upon him. It was, the expression of grief, which actually I, as a woman, am deeply touched by. But this last piece that I explored had to do with engagement. We as practitioners or as healthcare providers, being wholeheartedly engaged, vidya, the sense of deep enthusiasm or care as, in the experience of service to others. But when there's cumulative work demands, where there's stress, where there's structural violence or institutional violence, or where jobs are boring and repetitive and meaningless, burnout can be the result. I'm sure all of us, or many of us, have had that experience. And this is further complicated by the demands that patients make of us or our students make of us. I know as the head of a practice center, and I work, I'm not the kind of person that sits on the sidelines. I'm involved with all aspects of our practice and education here, but sometimes the demands that my students make of me, I find overwhelming and I'm not able to meet, or the institutional demands are such that we don't have, say, always enough resources to meet the demands of our own institution. Or things like errors in communication or feelings of inadequacy, or actually the sense of the work that a clinician is doing maybe not benefiting their patients, or the perception of suffering. So compassion, I realized very early on, was the kind of transformational experience. If we understand what compassion is, and we've cultivated the capacities that engender compassion, and that there are many misappraisals of compassion. For example, that suffering is catching, well, not through being compassionate, but actually through empathic or over-identification with suffering. Or that you can be overwhelmed, or it fatigues you, or it can make you sick, or you can be seen as weak or unprofessional if you're compassionate, or that compassion actually obscures power dynamics or prioritizes, for example, sympathy over justice. So one of the things that I needed to do was, in terms of the education of clinicians, was to make a clear distinction between empathy and compassion. It was not to devalue empathy, but to say that being in somatic or emotional resonance or cognitive resonance with another often is a step in a complex of responses that can lead toward compassion, but it's more of a feeling into, it's a vicariously sharing the same experience or a similar experience as the person who's suffering. Where, interestingly enough, compassion is a feeling for another, and it's not necessarily isomorphic to the state of the feeling or experience of the person who's suffering. Now, I want to just, I don't want to cover the whole field of neuroscience and social psychology here, but gosh, we sure have a lot of evidence about the benefits of compassion, really from the time of the Buddha onward. I think of about the Buddha taking care of the monk Tissa, whose body was covered with suppurating sores, and, sent his monks to get fresh robes and bathe the body of this very ill monastic, and saying basically to the monk body, who had probably been in bypass, if you take care of someone sick like Tissa, it is like taking care of me. It is, that deep realization that we are not separate from each other. And it was, thousands of years later, several thousand and a half years later, with Charles Darwin, although we often associate Darwin's work with the notion, which really came from Spencer, of the survival of the fittest. But as Darwin aged, he realized it was not so much the survival of the fittest, it was the survival of the kindest. Survival of the kindest. And what we've seen from the point of view of modern neuroscience and social psychology is that compassion actually primes well-being and resilience, in part by triggering areas of the brain associated with pleasure, our pleasure networks, and our reward networks. And in one very interesting study, participants who spent money on others to, benefit others, actually experienced much greater well-being than those who spent money on themselves. So this, is a study that's quite fascinating, because it, you would think that going out and buying something nice for yourself would just make you really happy. And this is the work of Elizabeth Dunn at the University of British Columbia. But actually the sense of deep satisfaction comes in terms of the study, came from benefiting others, spending money on others. We also know from the point of view of physiology that compassion has the potential for being profoundly health promoting, that it lowers stress hormones, that it lowers inflammation and strengthens immune response. And in one study done by Barbara Fredrickson and her colleagues, they found that people who have a life of meaning had much lower inflammation levels than those who are on the hedonic treadmill, which is, I think, pretty interesting in relation to the questions that I was asked. Do you think, what is our new normal going to be? Hopefully we will be off the hedonic, or many of us off the hedonic treadmill in the new post-COVID era. I really hope so. We also have very interesting evidence in social psychology and physiology about longevity. There's various studies that compassion actually promotes or improves longevity because it protects against stress. So I think that is quite interesting. In that regard, I often think about people like Nicholas Winton, who saved 669 children who were Jews in the Second World War, who were bound for the camps, and lived to the age of, I think, 107, and never spoke about or shared the fact that he had done all of this, this incredible work of saving these children, and had never shared that with anybody till his wife found out that these records up in the attic in the leather case. She opened it up and said, "Well, what is this?" And so, he finally told his wife when I think he was in his 80s. But there's very interesting evidence in relation to how important it is in terms of our own well-being not to be self-serving. We also know that compassion affirms our moral principles, and that when we restrain compassion, our sense of moral identity is negatively affected. And as well, that when we witness compassion, or when we engage in compassion, it morally elevates us. For example, seeing someone help another creates a state of elevation that inspires one to do the same. So, I know people send me little film clips all the time of people doing good things for animals or children or people who are unsheltered. And I know it's just, for me, it's like a vitamin to actually witness others being compassionate. And I also know from my work in the Himalayas in the Nomads Clinic and cooking for the unsheltered in our city and working in the prison system, I feel just cleaner, like a more aligned with my heart and my principles and my values when I'm not just out for myself. We also know from the work of James Fowler at the very interesting that serving others is actually a kind of an act of contagion. In other words, acts of kindness beget more acts of kindness in a kind of chain reaction of goodness. So, compassion is really important. And I think that one of the quotes that it was in the email about what you wanted me to do today comes from His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who said, compassion is not a luxury. It is an absolute necessity for human beings to survive. And I often say, in a kind of naughty way, mischievous way, I say, well, not just for human beings to survive, but for species of all kinds to survive. We're in this interdependent web of life, and we are beginning to understand that our actions, our consumerism, our attention being inhabited, colonized by the corporate world, our tendency toward addiction, all of this turns us away from the best of who we really are. So as a result of that, in looking at this pandemic, it's a crisis of enormous proportions. It's leading to an extraordinary death toll in my country, over 300,000 dead. I've forgotten what the global death toll is, but it's just staggering as I recall. It's also an economic catastrophe. There are businesses that are dying all over this country. The lockdowns and the job losses are triggering really the most significant financial crisis in my country, particularly for the middle class, lower middle class, and those who are impoverished since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And it's also a socio-cultural shock with the impacts that we can't even begin to grasp at this point. It's also revealing profound issues related to inequality in terms of race and in terms of poverty, in terms of our economic structures. But we have to understand that it is, well, a crisis of the mind and heart that goes to the very core of how we live as social beings and how we deal with failure, with moral suffering, with fear and with loss, and also how we die and how we care for those who die. So I, want to just finish this talk with two things. I developed this tool in as a result of this long exploration of compassion. It's called Grace, and it's a tool that is based very much in the world of Buddhist practice. But I don't let people know. I don't trot Buddhism out when I'm standing in front of lots of clinicians in a big medical center. But I offer this tool in this way. That it is a tool that you can have in your back pocket. And when you're in the presence of suffering, this tool can support you. And the tool is called grace. And the G of grace stands for gathering your attention. And so, that's something I think many of us know from our Buddhist practice. Gathering our attention is, allocating our attention, focused attention in this case, which is releasing our attention to the myriad distractions external to us, allowing us to get grounded, the G of grace. The R of grace is recalling our intention. Is to really drop into the calling that we have as Buddhist practitioners, as women, as clinicians, as teachers, as parents, which is to end suffering and not to turn away from the very moral, ethical ground of what gives us as human beings the sense of integrity, the dedication to ending harm. The A of grace is to attune first to oneself before attuning to others. In other words, to notice what's happening in the body, what's happening in the heart, and what's happening in the mind. Now, identify biases, fears, filters that might be there, so we can actually expand our subjectivity in a healthy way to attune to the experience of others, which is empathy. And the C of grace is to consider what will really serve, to look deeply. Often like a beginner in a very fresh way. And the E of grace has two aspects. E is to engage what it is to move into action, or maybe it's not acting in order to serve. And the second part of the E of grace is to end, to complete the interaction, grace. So I want to just finish this talk about compassion, how it is really what His Holiness said and what I believe to be the case. Compassion includes mindfulness, thank Buddha, and many other features. And I believe it to be the most important quality that we can manifest in our lives. Now, I began this talk with some words from Terry Tempest Williams. I want to just finish this talk with what else she wrote. She said, "There is deep beauty in not averting our gaze. No matter how hard it is, no matter how heartbreaking it can be, it is about presence. It is about bearing witness." I used to think bearing witness was a passive act. I don't believe that anymore. I think that when we are present, when we bear witness, when we do not divert our gaze, something is revealed. The very marrow of life. We change. A transformation occurs. Our consciousness shifts. So I encourage us to actualize the treasure of compassion as we move forward into this new life, the new normal, as we're entering into this phase of the pandemic. And I thank you so much for inviting me to share these thoughts about compassion, and I hope they serve.
Thank you so much, Roshi Joan. That was so inspiring and so much to think about, so much to absorb from all you were saying. And just a couple of things. To me, it sounds that what you are doing, your work in compassion and caring within the healthcare industry there, is totally at odds with what is coming or has been coming from your leadership. So I so admire you for that work. But my question is about something you were saying earlier that I've noticed with some friends, that some people are totally overwhelmed by the problems of the world at the moment, by climate change, by the problems of the pandemic by politicians, to the extent that some young people are even suicidal. And I just wondered what you can say to them to help them, if anything.
Well, this is why I wrote this book, Standing at the Edge, because I think we have every reason to be overwhelmed. And this is why compassion is so important today. Developing the qualities about which I spoke actually enhance resilience. And we need resilient people at this time. And it is not only in terms of the experience of practice, but it is also in the experience of community, the experience of relationship. Yeah. Look, moral distress, moral injury, apathy, addiction, it's rampant. Empathic distress, vicarious suffering, it's rampant. And as I said, it doesn't have to be the worst news in the world. Us falling over the edge, if you will, into the grip of suffering. And those of us who have managed to climb back up, if you will, to the high edge of our own virtue, develop a deep character. And anyone who's had a deep, sincere practice knows, whether it's the Buddha under the bo tree or Hakuin or Dogen or whatever the masters are, they all had moments of a profound existential crisis, utter overwhelm. And their capacity to sit in the charnel ground of their own suffering enhanced their capacity to be compassionate and wise.
Thank you. Jack has got a question for you. Jack? We just have to unmute yourself, Jack.
Yeah, thank you so much, Roshi Joan, for that teaching. I'm sure, we all greatly appreciate it. And I won't speak long because I think there's a couple of questions in the that people have put in into the chat thing. So we should probably go to those. I guess the thing that really strikes me is that, we have our Buddhist teachings and, every word you've uttered today is a Buddhist teaching, and yet spoken in a way to reach people in a more obvious way. Like if you just talk about the Four Noble Truths of the truth of suffering, compassion, not looking away, is the first noble truth. But if you just talk about the first noble truth, people don't, it's not enough just to say, there is suffering and you need to know you're suffering. And so it's so important to have people who can turn it all into sort of naturalistic language. And that's really valuable and part of what you've done for us today. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so do you want to go to the questions in here?
Did you have a question, Jack?
Did I have a question? I do, but maybe I could just email you later or something.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Jack. Now, Sky, would you like to speak or would you just like me to read out your question? Sorry, you're muted. I'll read it out. So Sky is saying, thank you deeply, Roshi Joan, for your teachings. I have been immersed in hospice and palliative care and been a teacher of Vipassana for many years. I have experienced periods of overload. My query is whether more supervision or formal debriefing would be of benefit, as often people are offering compassion and care in solitary situations. Roshi Joan?
Can you summarize the question? Sorry, I missed it.
Sky, would you be able to summarize the question?
Yes. So I've worked for many years on and off, and not at the moment, but in the past in hospice and palliative care. and also teacher of Vipassana. And often teaching alone makes it difficult, I found, and often was unable to see when I was falling off the edge, for example. And my question is, would it be helpful to have more formal supervision or someone to go to debrief more formally? Because sometimes when we get into this situation, it's hard to see what's going on. I was just wanting your feedback on that.
Well, absolutely. You know, no question. This is the value of Sangha, and totally. I mean, you know, and this is, I think the value of, you know, sometimes elders can bring that and others can bring that. I think operating as lone rangers in these a very high stress situation is really high risk for everybody. And so, yeah, absolutely. Great question. And I say yes.
Yeah.
It's not just supervision. You know, I feel that, you know, having a mentor, someone who really cares about your own spiritual formation and giving care to others is a spiritual practice. And, you know, having someone who really cares about your own spiritual formation is really critical if you're going to sustain engagement in the practice of caregiving.
And I just noticed when you were telling stories about people in hospital situations at the moment who are working on overload, how there's probably no capacity for them to debrief, to let go. So they must just take it home, come back the next day, and there it is.
Well, this is very true. And this is, you know, we're beginning to see a change in medical education as well as institutions realizing that nurses and doctors are leaving the profession in droves. And why? And it's the very reasons that we've explored this afternoon.
Yeah.
But I also want to say, just in relation to Buddhist teachers, I feel that Buddhist teachers, and I know this from my own experience, you know, we're sitting on the top of the pile, we're isolated, we're objects of projection, we have unmet emotional needs. Every doctor I know has unmet emotional needs, just like a Buddhist teacher has, you know, and you can't be really friends with your students or patients in the sort of buddy-buddy sense. But you also need, you know, a sense of there being a kind of overlighting presence, you know, a mentor, someone who really is able to, you know, support you give you feedback and help you correct course when you're experiencing futility or you are violating the precepts or becoming materialistic or in some delusion or another. So, yeah, relationship critical.
Yeah.
In this work.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Sky, and thank you, Roshi Joan. Meg has put forward some thoughts about... Meg, would you like to read out your question, or will I? You have to unmute.
Hi, there I am. Hello. Your wonderful talk. Thank you very much. It was very thought-provoking for me. As I said in my question in the chat box, I've read your book, great book also, and what my question was about was I've worked in health, in mainstream health for decades, and I guess some of the things you were talking about are things that I've struggled to at some level introduce or to talk about a lot, you know, over the years that I've been involved. And but of course you have managed to express it so clearly, you know, it's a real gift actually. I'm working with a group of First Nations people around trying to sensitise and develop mainstream health workers to be more inclusive and be able to serve First Nations people much better than the system currently does. And my question was, your work seems very relevant to that. And I was wondering whether there was a sort of like a simple, systematic sort of program that you had prepared or developed that would be useful for that, or so I was really looking for a resource apart from your book and your wonderful talk today.
Well, I mean, we have the Grace training, and it's also online. It's on Teachable. Also, my colleagues, Dr. Tony Back and Dr. Cinda Rushton, both, and I have produced some really interesting curriculum on, we call it being with suffering, not just being with dying, because gosh, it's covering all and everything. And that and the Grace training and the being with dying, we have all kinds of resources here at Upaya in the work that Frank Ostaseski and I do. I think the easiest thing in a certain way is like really integrating Grace and using the Grace tool as a sort of template that where you explore the issues related to, the different aspects of grace, real unpacking of, what it is to bring your attention, how over-identification, what is our motivation as caregivers, as social activists, and so on. So, it's a pretty cool tool. And it kind of has everything in it. And it's, if you're a Buddhist, everything in there comes right out of our practice.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work. I just am so grateful you're doing this work with First Nations people. Wonderful.
Thank you, Meg, and thank you, Joan. And following on from that, there's a question in the chat room from Nick. Excuse me. Could you please go over the C in Grace again, because I missed it?
Oh, consider what will really serve. Consider what will really serve. So, really, that process is, what is it? It's about being a wise person. So you're grounded, your intention is aligned with values, you're in resonance with your own subjectivity, you've expanded your subjectivity to include others or another, and so on. And that's the foundation, then, the sort of base where a wise path through can be discerned. So C is consider what will really serve.
Nick, does that answer it, or would you like to say something else? You have to unmute.
Thank you very much. No, that's fantastic. That clarifies it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? Venerable Chikwan, would you like to say anything as a fellow Zen practitioner? You have to unmute, Chikwan.
Well, thank you, Joan. That was wonderful. I mean, I've been following your teaching and following you for a long time, actually, quietly, silently, and often online. I have read your book, as others here have, and we've talked at Sakyadhita quite a lot on your work. Yes, I'm very happy to hear you have developed this tool called Grace, and that's something that I might contact you a little bit more about it, whether or not we can't have a group here in Australia, I think many of us from Melbourne, but here in Australia, where we could work on it with your guidance. I think that would be a very useful tool to develop, because then that would bring a lot of the other teachings from your book and what you also deliver in your community. I don't know if everybody here is aware of Joan has a wonderful centre called Upaya, and with many teachers, so most of you will know, but there's also a very fabulous online presence and teachings to that too. So if you're not aware, please look it up. It's a wonderful tool, and yes, helps people like me too. But thank you, Joan, and thank you for taking your time out to come and be with us today. It's yeah, very, very special. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Wonderful. Wonderful.
Thank you, Venerable Chikwan, and some thanks have come in on the chat line. From Rima, deep thanks, Roshi Joan, for your huge heart, inspiring teacher, and ongoing guidance through action. From Dorsey, thank you for your wisdom, Roshi Joan, and from Heidi, thanks, Roshi Joan, for a wonderful talk and the depth and wisdom shown throughout every word. So are there any other questions? Is anyone else, or else I'll sign off. So I'd just like to thank you very much, Roshi Joan, for your time today. We know how busy you are with all those things you're doing, not just with your centre, but your work with the sick and the dying. So we really appreciate the time you've taken today. And as you've been seeing on the chat room, the video of this talk will be posted on our YouTube channel sometime later that week. So I urge you to check that out. Tell your friends about it. It was such an inspiring talk, and yeah, look out for that and enjoy listening to it again. And also, if you'd like to continue being inspired by Roshi Joan and you haven't done so, I suggest you read her latest book, which is Standing at the Edge, as you've heard. A fascinating idea. Thank you all for joining us. We hope we can bring you more teachings in 2021. In the meantime, I wish you all the very best for the festive season for 2021, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday. And a particular thank you to Roshi Joan. It's a Saturday afternoon where you are, so enjoy your evening.